I was challenged by Jim Beam to show one way to use bourbon in the kitchen, and the hardest part was picking just one. Even if you're not much of a drinker, bourbon is a clutch ingredient in the kitchen. Say you ran out of vanilla extract halfway into a recipe that calls for it. Put some bourbon in a saucepan, carefully simmer it until it's reduced by half, and use that. Made some chicken for dinner, but you don't have any wine to deglaze the pan? Use bourbon to deglaze and build that up into a 2-minute pan sauce. Barbecue sauces, chilies, splash of bourbon. But the challenge was to show one use. So here's the easiest marinade I've got. In a zip top bag, combine 2 parts bourbon with 1 part balsamic vinegar. Like any marinade, you could pack this thing with aromatics like garlic and rosemary, but I'm cooking a ribeye today, so this 2-ingredient marinade is an exercise in gently complementing the taste of a good steak, not blasting it with flavor. For a regular 1-inch thick grocery store cut of ribeye, this marinade only needs to work for like 45 minutes. You probably wouldn't want to go more than 2 hours because bourbon and vinegar are both tenderizing agents, so you run the risk of turning your meat to mush. One benefit to such a short-term marinade is you can leave the bagged meat out at room temperature for 45 minutes while you preheat your pan or make a side dish, like maybe a mashed potato, but this time after you drain 2 pounds of cubed and boiled potatoes, you combine a half stick of butter, a 2-ounce shot of bourbon, and half a cup of whole milk, plus salt and pepper, of course, just to get warm before adding the cooked potatoes and smushing all of that together into a really nice bourbon butter mashed potato. But I wouldn't want to mention any of that. I'm focused on just one recipe for today. After 45 minutes in the marinade, pull the meat out and dry the surface completely before applying the proper amount of salt. That's about 1 teaspoon per pound of boneless ribeye. From here on out, you're the boss of how you like your steak cooked. You could grill it over an open flame, do a reverse sear. You could even skip all that waiting and spend the past 45 minutes cooking the meat sous vide in the bag full of marinade. I've already covered the entire conceit of this video. Use bourbon and balsamic to make the world's easiest, deeply flavored marinade. So while I've got you on the line, I might as well walk you through the decision-making process of my steak cookery for today. I'll crank the heat as high as I can and squirt a teaspoon of high smoke point oil into the pan to help with heat distribution. These ribeyes have a thick band of fat on one side, so I like to start the process by holding that to the pan with tongs. If you only cook the steak on the broad faces, this fat won't render in just 5 minutes, so it'll be chewy and unenjoyable. Once that's super darkened, the timer officially starts. For a 1-inch thick boneless ribeye like this one over ripping high heat, I only want it in the pan for 5 minutes total to reach medium rare status. You'll notice that I'm not a flip once and only once kind of steak cooker. I'll link you to Chris Young's research on how frequent flipping leads to more evenly cooked steak. Over the 5-minute cook time, I might flip this thing up to 10 times. One more creative liberty I take: I don't butter baste. This might be a hot take for the types of people who like to watch cooking videos where the chef spanks every ingredient before using it, but butter basting, in my opinion, uses up too much butter, burns a lot of ingredients, and makes too big of a mess for what it adds to the dish. I'll just put a couple pads of butter right on the cooked steak and crank some pepper over it before tinting that with foil. You already know that you have to rest every steak for at least 5 minutes, so you might as well imbue the flavor of fresh dairy fat and freshly cracked pepper now with 0 basting and no burning. I'll just rest it, slice it, serve it on a handmade artisanal dinner plate on a bed of bourbon butter mashed potatoes, and hit the whole dish with a reasonable pinch of flaky finishing salt. Your first bite is going to be noticeably bourbon forward. Since all the alcohol was cooked out, you're left with these warm, unctuous notes that you might not notice when drinking bourbon in a cocktail. Jim Beam is rested in charred oak barrels for twice as long as legally required to be categorized as straight bourbon whiskey, and in less than an hour, the meat has absorbed all those years of developed complexity. The only reason I think you might not want to try this marinade is if you make a big batch of it, you might feel like a cup of high quality bourbon and a half cup of balsamic vinegar isn't worth the cost to make a couple steaks taste a little better. But this happens to be a 0 waste recipe. Instead of throwing all that marinade out, just pour it into a little saucepan, put it over a small burner and let it come to a boil for a second. This did, after all, hold a bunch of raw beef in it. Turn the heat down and let it simmer. This marinade was 2 parts bourbon and 1 part balsamic, so to make it into a glaze, add 1 part maple syrup. Honey or agave work too, but I'm a maple fella. It is not often that I do full-on proper recipe development, but this glaze is why I made this a 2-ingredient marinade instead of 3. I tried it once with soy sauce in the mix, but in order for the stuff to be salty enough to properly season the meat, it would reduce into an inedible salt bomb. Better to just salt the steak after it's marinated and season this glaze to taste. You'll know it's time to cut the heat when the reduction develops small foamy bubbles and it can lightly coat a spoon. Take this off the stove, season it with a pinch of salt, a few cranks of black pepper, and an optional shake of both onion powder and garlic powder. Pour it into a little jar, keep that in the fridge, and now you've got a sweet, tangy, bourbon, balsamic, maple glaze that's just about as versatile as its star ingredient. Now, the next time you're almost done making smoked chicken wings, brush on some glaze and grill them for a minute on each side. Or next time you make a big piece of salmon, glaze it during the last few minutes of cooking for a sweet but tangy bourbon shellacking. Hell, just dip store-bought chicken tendies in a ramekin of this stuff. If there could ever possibly be something more quintessentially American than an apple pie with medical debt, it's dipping fried meat in a sticky sweet goo made from Kentucky straight bourbon. This is a marinade that transforms into a sauce. You gotta try it. Go on now, get